This world is chaos, and chaos, to paraphrase him, will kick your ass. I've chosen for my text today, not, as you might think, a scripture passage or a spiritual book, but something that's had a profound effect on my own life. A couple of years ago, I first became aware of a clinical psychologist called Dr. Jordan Peterson. And he kind of came to fame over YouTube, and so during the COVID pandemic that we're all still kind of suffering from a little bit, one of the reasons why we're doing this video, he was promoting his book, The 12 Rules for Life, and he was also embarking on a campaign to really raise awareness about the deficiencies that have crept into academia and have given rise to a lot of what can now be called identity politics or woke culture, or the Marxist utopia that we seem to have been breeding into our young people for quite some time. And he's very outspoken on those subjects. And given his own background in academia and his own grasp of psychology, I think he's been able to help an awful lot of people who have found themselves to be lost in our culture. They don't trust the mediums of the mainstream. They don't trust of pandemic, when we find ourselves locked out of a lot of the political situation. We cannot actively change anything that the governor is doing, and we feel impinged upon by society to do all sorts of things that we would prefer not to do. And as a result, we are in a spiral of decline. I won't say depressed, but sometimes we can feel like that. And I think Dr. Peterson's book, The 12 Rules for Life, can really help on a natural level. And I would encourage everybody to at least watch the videos of his lectures on YouTube, but also to spend time really delving into some of these things, because they touch very profound truths in human nature. One of the reasons why, and I know that particularly in some Catholic circles, psychology is seen as part of the dark arts, something that is to be distrusted in and of itself, and that gave rise to what can only be called as a kind of happy, clappy, Catholic, sentimental attitude towards the world. What I like about Dr. Peterson is he cuts through all of that instantly when he says that this world is chaos, and chaos, to paraphrase him, will kick your ass. The world is a difficult place, and to expect it to not be is already to give in to part of the delusion that separates ourselves from reality. To think that somehow this life will always be sweetness and life is wrong. Of course, when we put that into a Catholic concept, we have the answer right in Scripture. We have original sin. We know that from a moment in time of the human being becoming self-conscious and self-aware, immediately thereafter there was a fall. There was something done to human nature that disarranged it and disordered it just enough to make it impossible for us to see God face to face and to walk with him in the garden. And we've been struggling with that reality since the dawn of time. And therefore, for a psychologist or a clinical psychologist like Dr. Peterson to grasp that essential truth and to start speaking to young men and women as, oh, why did you ever expect your life to be better than it is? Isn't that just building yourself up for a fall? Is quite refreshing, because that's really something that we should be preaching in our schools, in our universities, and from our pulpits on a regular basis. The trick, of course, is not to let that knowledge throw us into despair. If everything is chaos and if everything is a disaster and if life is so hard, what's the point of living it? And to answer that, we actually have to go back to the 60s, believe it or not, and a book that the French existentialist philosopher Albert Camus wrote. It's called The Myth of Sisyphus, and because of its title, clearly harkens back to the great myth of the king of Sisyphus who was rolling the stone up the hill for eternity. And in that book, Albert Camus finds the meaning of life. The meaning of life isn't success. The meaning of life is how we face the struggle. Because life is oppressive. Life is difficult. There are many things outside of our control, and yet we still have one thing to cling to, at least in a natural level: ourselves. We can actually be better people. We can be more in tune with the chaos. We can learn to dodge some of it and to live through and put up with the rest. And in so doing, we answer the great philosophical question, why are we here? We are here to try our best. We are here in the search, not for happiness in this life, but for happiness in a life yet to come. Now, I doubt very much that Albert Camus and even Dr. Peterson would agree with that last summation, but as Catholics, we must believe in it because it's the reason for being for us. We want to return back not only to the Garden of Eden, but we want to be transformed, to be moved beyond this physical realm into a truly supernatural realm, albeit with body and soul. We want to be resurrected. We want to be in the presence of God forever. And so we see this world as a shadow, as a veil of tears, because that's exactly what it is. And that's the starting point for Dr. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. Rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. It sounds so simplistic. It's so obvious. And yet how many people actually care about how they present themselves to the outside world? Do they take care of their own posture? Now, in a natural understanding, in a natural context, as interacting with the things of this world, Dr. Peterson is much more informed about the psychology of these things than I ever will be. But there are strange parallels between that natural approach to the world and the supernatural approach of even someone like St. Therese. One of her best penances, she writes, was to sit properly on her chair without letting her back touch the chair back, therefore perfecting her posture. But you try that for 10 minutes and tell me that it doesn't hurt. And therefore, all of these natural things are capable of becoming supernaturalized, mainly by our intention. But we also have to understand the psychology behind that intention. Why do we want to do these things? But standing up straight with your shoulders back projects an image of you to the outside world. It is saying to them, I have value at least in myself. I am honest. I have integrity. I am not bowed down by the woes and travails of this world. I am ready to meet them head on. I am a man not only with confidence, but with courage. Now, psychologically, as Dr. Peterson will point out in his book, that means so much to the inner self. That is at least a test of our own courage in the real world. Yes, we might be beaten down, but we're not going to start off accepting that as a given. We're going to challenge it We're going to try and navigate this world, and we're going to do so from this posture of dignity. The notion of posture, of course, is something that's completely familiar to us. When we think of standing, particularly, we think of standing around, the circumstantibus, who would stand around the altar, for those prayers are offered in the canon of the Mass for those people. I often joke with my own servers and school kids that, oh, you lot standing around the altar, this prayer is being said for you. And so how we stand around would suggest that it's important. In the days before pews were ever introduced into Catholic churches, everybody stood for everything. And so therefore, how we stand in the presence of man also reflects how we stand in the presence of God. And when we think of that term standing, we can draw all sorts of parallels. Standing could be the table of effect, the standings in a league table, the standings in a golf tournament, the standings in any sporting trophy. It's how we refer to everyone else. Where do you stand relative to this proposition? Well, our proposition in nature is to stand with that human dignity that's been endowed by God, but also to stand with a supernatural component, to be as integral human beings as possible. To say what we mean and mean what we say needs also to be lived out in the practical sense, because as body and soul, our soul is only known to others through our actions. And so standing up straight is as important, I would argue, as kneeling up straight. Because when we adopt the posture of kneeling, we are adopting an attitude towards God and to God alone. We do not take the knee for any other cause. Despite what everybody else wants to say in the world, the taking of a knee is an act of submissiveness. It's not an act of pride. It's not an act of, I agree. It's an act of supplication. It's an act, ultimately, of humiliation. I have been subjected. I am lesser than you. Now, I don't think it's particularly healthy to ever apply that to a human natural situation. Which one of us would seek out someone to be conquered by? Now, coming from Scotland, that's a little bit more understandable. We have been conquered, but we resent the fact, and we do not kneel unless we are forced to do so. But to be compelled to kneel is different from willing it, from choosing to kneel. And when we come to our church, when we kneel in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, we are making a clear, unequivocal statement that God is in charge. We are reminding ourselves of that very fact in the act of our genuflection, in the act of our posture of kneeling during Mass and in consecration and during Holy Benediction. We are identifying publicly that we are not the centre of the universe. We are acknowledging God's complete dominion over us. Now, therefore, kneeling can take all sorts of forms, just as standing. If we are to slouch our way through this world, walking through and standing at the coffee table with an attitude of, I care less about me, then how can we expect anything good to come from that? Therefore, when we approach our God and kneel in his presence, a lot can be determined about how serious we are about that statement that we're making. Do we rest our backsides on the pew? Do we slouch over the kneeler in front of us? Or do we take the time to perfect ourselves as St. Therese did in the external component of our prayer life to then better the quality of our internal prayer life? Do we tell ourselves by what we do what we mean? The second rule of these 12 rules for life is all about making life more difficult. Now you might ask, what's the point of that? Life is already difficult. You've already said so, Father. Jordan Peterson says so. Why on earth would you want to go out of your way to make it more difficult? It depends what you're seeking. Depends what you're trying to achieve. If you're only trying to achieve happiness in this life, then it doesn't make sense at all. It would be much better for you just to curl up in a ball. But if you are going to embrace this world and to meet its challenges head on and to be connected, both body and soul, then this second rule is for you. Treat yourself like you are someone responsible for helping. Now, in a natural sense, that has all sorts of connotations psychologically. Be prepared to meet the external, extra-mental challenges of this world. Help. Do good in the world. That's what that really means. Now, the psychology of it all can be boiled down a lot more and distilled, but the essential quality has to be that we are in this world with other people, and we can either choose to be adversely affected by them or to positively engage with them. And in positive engagement, it has to be all about being responsible for helping. Now, helping can be understood. Helping to do what? Helping ultimately to perfect that other human being. Helping ultimately that other human being to get to heaven. And so therefore, Jordan Peterson, probably unknowingly to himself, uses this second rule of life to engage with the notion of charity, to actually show what it takes for the human being to be truly integral, means to be prepared to be responsible, to take responsibility firstly for your own actions, but then to consider those actions as helping you and helping others. And that is the very definition of charity as the Catholic Church understands it. It's different from this concept of love. It's much more engaged in the world. It's much more about doing something. Correctly motivated and in the correct state, anything, largely speaking, is capable of becoming a charitable action. The third rule follows the same suit. Make friends with those who want the best for you. That also can make life miserable. Who wants to be reminded of their flaws? But in order to actually participate in the world, we need sometimes someone to hold the mirror up to us, to see us as we truly are, not just as the extra-mental projection of who we would like or who we think we are. This falls under the bracket of fraternal correction. Or can we truly be friends who, motivated for the best of reasons, will tell us the home truths, will actually pull us aside and say, that wasn't so cool, you shouldn't have done that. And to reflect not only the things that we are proud of, but the things that we are sorry for. That can change our entire attitude to how we engage with the world if we are brave enough and courageous enough to seek out people who will remind us of who we really are. We will be healthier for it, because we will not allow ourselves to exist only in our own little echo chamber where only our good qualities are reflected back upon us. We will be challenged on a daily basis. We will grow to know ourselves. And as the Greeks have always said, knowing thyself is the beginning of wisdom. So to take time to identify friends and to identify people to become friends with who have your best interest at heart can be a massive challenge, but one that will bear fruit. When I was in seminary, a few years ago now, my spiritual director told me that this year, this third year I was going into, must be devoted to helping your brother carry his burden. And in doing so, you will actually forget that you have your own burden to carry. But in doing so, that has to be reflected back. And so people then come to help you. And you look at them in astonishment. Well, I don't have that problem. That's not me. But oh yes, it is. More often than we ever care to admit. The fourth rule for life, according to Dr. Peterson, can be summed up under the title envy and how to avoid it. It simply states, compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. This can be seen as a kind of goal-setting opportunity. If we set benchmarks that are impossible, we will fail. And if we constantly set benchmarks that are impossible, we'll fail constantly and become depressed. If you're living in a small one-bed apartment and have an average income job and can barely afford bus fare, how are you going to transform that life to having the 2 cars, the boat, and the big house? And if you set that as your goal, you'll nearly always be defeated. And that can lead to that spiral of decline, both mentally and spiritually. So compare yourself to you. Don't compare yourself to others. See whether or not you have made progress from day to day, would seem to be a better benchmark for the individual rather than trying to compete in one way or another with some mythical creature. This is particularly important in Catholic circles where we read the lives of the saints and we are told to emulate them. But how possible is that? The more lives of the saints we read, the more impossible it seems sometimes, the more difficult and challenging. These people were given specific graces, were put through particular torments to be perfected. None of that's happening to me. How can I possibly live up to that standard? That's very common in the people I speak to. Oh, Father, the Blessed Mother had all of these massive advantages. How can I possibly live up to her unique, graceful state of life? Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and you will make progress. It's good that we all have a target. It's good that we all have ambition, particularly in the spiritual life. As St. Thomas says, you must aim high in order to allow the trajectory of the arrow to correct itself and at least come approximately to hitting the target. But if we can compare ourselves to ourselves on a daily basis, we are actually taking control of our lives. There is too much chaos out there. There are too many other things that can move us, too many circumstances that become obstacles for us to ever really truly set our sights on something that we cannot 100% affect. That's even in the natural level. For everything else in the supernatural level, we rely on God to take care of those obstacles. But we must first take care of ourselves. And so I think, again, this all falls within the Catholic understanding of the conscience, which needs to be examined on a daily basis. As we go to bed that night, we should look back upon the day and critically analyze. Not just yeah, or I did this, and this, and I'm sorry. But to critically look at why. What was the motivation that made us do these things, whether good or bad? And can, if it has been good, can it be recreated the next day and or even better perfected? And so that examination of conscience, that critical self-appraisal, who was I today? Was I good? Did I fail in my duties in some way? And if so, what made me fail? And am I truly responsible for that failure? Or was it circumstantial? Was it outside of my control? That seems to be what Dr. Peterson is trying to do, because that brings equilibrium. It brings back reality from the outside world back into our own psyche and our own consciousness and back into our own conscience. We cease to take responsibility for the things that we cannot change, and we only concentrate on the things that we can. And then that next morning, when we jump out of bed and stand tall in the presence of our God and humble ourselves in our posture of kneeling, we then ask the question, for all the good that I did yesterday, let me do the same today and perfect this particular aspect of it. If there were particular challenges the other day, do they still exist or have they gone away? Has sleep knitted up the ravelled sleep of care sufficiently for us to go boldly into the new world? And in doing so, do we carry Christ with us? Do we understand that this day will be better than the next day precisely because it is the next day? One step closer to perfection, one step closer to the imitation of Christ. Another opportunity to practice charity. And so those first 4 rules draw us closer towards a better understanding of self. We put ourselves out there. We project our image by standing tall or kneeling tall in the presence of our God and man. And we try to treat ourselves as someone who is responsible for doing good in the world. And in order that we don't get misled by our own sense of propaganda and by our own sense of ego, we test that theory by having friends who are rooted in the best of us, who want only to see the best perfection of us. And then we compare ourselves with ourselves day by day, challenging ourselves constantly in the perfection both of the natural order and the supernatural order. The 5th and 6th rules for life concentrate more not so much on the self, but on the interaction of that self with others and society at large. The 5th rule is to do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. But Father, you might say, how can it be that I would never like my child? Ha! Liar! There are often times that you dislike your children. You dislike them when they are disobedient. You dislike them when they are too caught up in their own little world to form part of that family circle. And therefore, when you dislike them, guess what? The rest of the world dislikes them too. Because disobedience is infectious. And so, Dr. Peterson is laying out here, I think, some social interaction rules. Don't let your child do anything that makes you dislike them. Could be boiled down to, don't let your child be disobedient. It's one of the things that I like to scare new parishioners with, that God, in one sense, doesn't love you. He doesn't care that much about you until you become lovable. And that, we understand, happens through the grace of baptism. It's a gift that God gives to us that makes us like him a little bit more and he to like us. There is some connection made. The doors of heaven have been opened and the potential for reaching our true supernatural end is revealed. Of course, that potential needs still to be reduced to act by good works, by faith and hope and charity. But in doing so, we also learn something about how our relationship with God can be truly said to be fatherly. God loves us more when we make ourselves lovable by doing what he wants. When we observe the commandments, when we live up to the precepts of the church, when we strive for virtue rather than vice in our life, we are doing the things that God put us on this earth for, and therefore he loves us more. And as a result of loving us more, sends us more graces, and the cycle continues to perpetuate itself. The easiest way to test this theory is to sin. And to sin gravely. Because when we do sin, we separate ourselves from God. We know that we've done something wrong. We've done it deliberately. That's what a mortal sin is. We have taken the knife to our own state of grace. And God will, of course, extend all graces to bring us back if we ask for them. But in that moment of sinning, can it be said that God still loves us? Yes, of course. Take comfort from that fact. But does he love us in the same way as he loves the saints? Does he love us in the same way as he did the day before? That's a question. Because the more lovable we are to God means the more we are doing the things of God and living up to the standards that he has placed upon us. And most of those, and I think this is where Jordan Peterson has cornered the market on this, are natural. Can we be naturally integral beings? Can we connect our body and our soul together, our reason and our will, in such a way as to live our life in union with God on a regular basis? The sixth rule for life, then, is also to do with society at large. Put your own house in order, and in perfect order, before you criticize the world. The people with the kids who cry at the back of the church aren't really in a position to tell others how they should be bringing up their children. A common occurrence in most parishes. That's not to say that there's moral guilt applied in anything, but as we learn from Christ himself, he who is without sin cast the first stone. So in order to have a truly real sense of entitlement to criticize the world, one must first have spent every effort trying to perfect your own life. Now, perfection in this world is impossible, but it's the attempt to be perfect that I think Jordan Peterson is talking about here, and certainly within the supernatural realm. Do we actually spend the time doing rules 1 through 5 correctly every day? And if we do, then we get a glimpse on the ability to be able to criticize the world at large. Because we know fundamentally within ourselves that we are trying to work for a higher common goal. That can be very challenging. Now, I think Dr. Peterson put this in particularly against the social justice warriors who want to bring about a utopian state, Marxist state for all that, in this world, and who care more about climate change or ending poverty or racism or the identity politics which we're surrounded in right now, more than actually looking inside themselves and putting their own house in order. Now, this ties back to that rule number 4, when we compare ourselves to who we were yesterday and not someone else today. If we constantly look at this world and say it's broken and it's everyone else's fault, we will constantly be depressed. We will, in fact, turn that depression and envy into spite. We will end up self-hating ourselves because we have no control over what anyone else does. And it's a futile exercise. And without the struggle of self-perfection, we don't even have the consolation of Sisyphus. Therefore, put your own house in order. Do not allow pharisaical ideas and practices to enter into your mindset. How dare you judge someone when you are guilty of the same thing? Our Lord talks about this a lot. You might have something in the corner of your eye, if you remember that story. The 7th rule for life is do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. Now this enters into a whole new world of psychological dynamism. To do what is expedient would seem to be the natural thing to do. And I think that Dr. Peterson is beginning here to see a transcendent meaning in life. Why are we here? Seems to be much more expedient to look after ourselves, to do only enough work to get us by, to never stretch ourselves would seem to be the expedient thing. And I speak from some experience. When I was in engineering school, we had a professor who would teach us directly, what's the point of getting above 51% in the exam? If the pass mark is 50, do enough to pass. Why get an A or a B? It explains my score sheet at the end of my term. But the point he was making is that within the human structures that we have created, particularly within engineering, to do extra, to do more, is expensive. It costs more concrete, more steel to build a bridge that will stand for 100 years when you only need it to stand for 20. And we see that in the very fabric of our cities. How many buildings now are built for a century or a lifetime? Most houses have a 20-year lifespan. Most office buildings less than that, without constant repair and renewal. How different then those great cathedrals and palaces that were built by previous generations that are still standing, millennia later sometimes. How is it possible that man has moved from this sense of building for eternity into building for expediency? Can I build this now quickly and get the rewards quickly, even if I have to then build it again and again and again and again and again? And so Dr. Peterson, I think, when he talks about this, is talking about self-fulfillment. Do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. Try and do things that last in your life, that have meaning, true meaning. Now, the derivation of meaning can expand here all sorts of directions, but in a Catholic concept, that meaning has to be look after your spiritual soul. Look after that light of sanctifying grace that was given to you with baptism and which you have tended so carefully. Make sure that never goes out. And in the process, you will have all the graces necessary to do the good that you are brought into this world for, to perfect that light. Again, the image comes back, as St. Therese would say, of the different vessels that carry water. There is a small jar and a large jar, and both are filled to the brim. And this represents our happiness, our ultimate happiness in heaven. Both jars are full. They are both completely satisfied. But there is a qualitative difference between the size of one and the size of other. One holds significantly less grace than the other. And that's a fixed position when we die. But it is a movable position when we're alive. And our lives should be spent, I think, chasing down those things that are truly meaningful in order to expand the size of our own individual container, to change its diameter and its depth and its volume, to be capable of holding more grace in this world. And so that when we finally go to meet our Maker, when this veil of shadows comes to an end, our container is large enough to not only be completely full, but to be completely different and altered in shape and size from the one originally given us. That would be, I think, the participation of our life with God in this world. And so therefore, self-fulfillment in a meaningful way means looking and examining our life for those meaningful things. Family, friendship, the pursuit not of happiness, but of charity. The 8th rule of life is, or should be, standard practice for all of us. Tell the truth, it says, or at least don't lie. Now, I think that little caveat at the end is there because we're all going to lie. We all lie all the time. But mainly, we lie to ourselves. We reinforce what we like to consider positive, and we often just simply ignore that which is negative. And that then feeds back into rules number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so in this list that Dr. Peterson has produced, he has also created an interaction between different rules to strengthen each other as they build towards the betterment of the human being. As the TV show House was famed for saying, everyone lies, always. Because we want to hide that inner part of ourselves from everyone else. We are ultimately ashamed of who we really are most of the time. And so we tell lies to project a better image so that people think more highly of us, so that our standing in life can be improved. That can separate us ultimately from reality. Like the boy who cried wolf, we lose all trust with those that we need to share trust. We are not trustworthy because those things that we have said about ourselves can be demonstrably proved wrong. And unless we are choosing our friends who are really looking for the best in us, and we are examining our consciences and comparing ourselves to who we were yesterday and not with some arbitrary figure outside, we can very easily lock ourselves up in our own echo chamber, where our lies simply become expedient means to get what we want rather than what we need. And therefore, an attempt to tell the truth is an attempt to engage in reality again and not to descend into madness. And at least don't lie. If we can't confront reality, because reality is scary sometimes, there are just truths out there that are just too big to contemplate, we at least acknowledge that fact by not lying about them. We simply say, I don't know. It's too big. I don't know the answer. And in doing so, we humble ourselves again and touch reality as it really is, not as we would prefer it to be. The 9th lesson, or the 9th rule for living a good, natural life, is to assume that the person you are listening to knows something that you don't. Now, I find this one almost impossible to practice because, like everybody else, I naturally think I'm the smartest person in the room. And that hubris, that sense of pride, is in all of us. The fact that you are challenging some of what I'm saying now is precisely the reason why this rule exists. But in allowing ourselves and creating a mindset that says, I might not know everything, and this person that's talking might know something that I don't, seeds the essential amount of doubt in our life that is necessary to combat and to change our world. To allow ourselves the humility to say that while I think all of this makes sense to me, I might still be wrong. And when we come to put that into a concept of faith, well, faith is nothing but the conquering of doubt. But we have to allow that doubt to exist, because there is no faith in heaven. We will know for sure. And therefore, while we live on this earth, there is always a little bit of doubt. Otherwise, what's the point of having the grace of faith? And that means that things that we think are sure and certain can always be open to challenge. Not infinite challenge, not infinite regression, not the critical method of tearing everything down for the sake of tearing it down like the empiricalists and the rationalists have done post-Enlightenment. But to allow enough wiggle room to expand our own understanding. Because if we think we know it all, then why do we need anybody else, including God? If we don't need the light of revelation within us in some capacity, either through the church or through our own intellectual endeavours, what's the point of living? You would be admitting that you are perfect already. And no matter how much you know, and this is an aspect that I don't think Dr. Peterson has considered in this 9th lesson, or 9th rule, no matter how much you know, knowledge isn't the same thing as wisdom. They're different. You can know all sorts of things and be able to put none of it into practice. And therefore, what's the point of knowing it? I remember once, we were receiving a lecture from a very eminent historian who said that specialization in academia means you know more and more about less and less. So as Catholics, we want to take that universal view. We want to look at everything in a 360-degree manner. We want to be able to look at the various aspects of history and science and literature, not just from a Catholic perspective, but how the other person would see it, because we need to be able to integrate and inculcate our ideas in them, and therefore we need to know from where they stand. The last two rules for life seem to be a little bit difficult. They're difficult to practice. The 10th rule is to be precise in your speech. And by that, even Dr. Peterson makes the immediate connection with knock and the door will be open. Now, what's the connection between the two things? Well, if our entire life is spent creating a narrative, we start in one frame of mind and we end in another. We move from being here on the grace spectrum to being somewhere else on the grace spectrum. We move from earth to heaven. And we tell that narrative to ourselves through the things that we do, our likes, our dislikes, the people we meet, the amount of time we spend attempting to perfect ourselves in that struggle to roll the stone up the hill again and again for its own sake. Then the preciseness of our speech is necessary, because speech is just a verbal idea. And the more precise we speak, the more precisely we think. And the clearer we think, the more efficient we become in that journey along our narrative, reducing our potential to act all the quicker and more efficaciously or efficiently. We have too many choices. Most people spend most of their youth and young adulthood trying to keep all the doors open. We want limited or unlimited potential in our lives. We like it. I can do this. I can be this. I can be a fireman, an astronaut, a priest. I can do all these things. And yet, all of a sudden, from the minute that we're born, those doors start to close. Circumstances define those things. We're too old. We're too short. We're too fat. We're too bald. And that's just the things that we have no control over. What about the things that we do? Every choice that we make either keeps a door open or closes it. And as we progress through life, we need to be able to articulate that plan that we have for ourselves. Which door will we walk through and why? And in being precise in our language, we are being precise in our thinking, and therefore we are choosing aright. Not always the easiest, but the best for us. And so to speak with precision is to focus our potential. It's to ask the right questions of ourselves and of the world that we engage with. Ultimately, without precise speech, we don't know how to talk to God. When we think of prayer, most of us, I think, concentrate on the repetition. A prayer is something that we read. It's not really something that we speak, even though it might be vocal. But a true prayer, I would argue, or at least another way of looking at prayer, is to focus on the intention and then spend the time distilling that intention into as few words as possible to make it laser focused. And we see this within the Mass that we say, this ancient liturgy that's been passed down to us for generation after generation, for millennia. The older the prayer is, the shorter it is, the more condensed it is, the more focused that intention. Oh God, who has done these things for us, do this now for us in the name of your saint, because he has exemplified these attributes. Simple, focused, absolutely encapsulating a whole panoply of different ideas focused into one simple sentence. That would seem to be a better mode of prayer. And so when people come to me and ask, Father, I feel very dry or arid in my prayer life, I don't know what to say, I get distracted so easily when I'm saying my rosary or I'm trying to do my holy hour, I'm too busy worrying about the children or what to do at work or what's for dinner that night, that I'm really not achieving much and I get discouraged and I want to give up. And the answer has to be, or the answer is, at least if you ask me, to focus your intentions and be more precise in your speech. If you spend longer thinking about exactly what it is that you want from your prayer life, what do you want God to do? If prayer is a petition, then the more precise that petition, the more likely it is of being heard and understood. If it's just a vague petition for generalities, then you'll get a general response. So focus your intention. I want to pray for my husband, for his intentions. Well, what is our intention? What does he want? What are you praying for? I'm praying for him to do, particularly if you're married, whatever I ask him to do, whenever I want him to do it. That's very common. But it'd be better, I want my husband to get to heaven. I want him to take his spiritual life more seriously. I want him to embrace Christ more closely. And in that embrace, that has to be understood to be sacrifice, a willingness to give up what he would prefer to do for what he needs to do. And so that then can form and transform your prayer into one sentence. And then if you need the words given to your church and hallowed by time, you say something simple, something meaningful. The Hail Mary, the Hail Holy Queen, the Our Father. Because duration of prayer isn't the same as quality of prayer. And quality of prayer is locked more with the intention, and duration is just locked in terms of the amount of time spent. Now, obviously, we would want the two things to come together. The more perfect intention and the longer duration will be a better prayer. But for most of us living in the world, it's a question of where do you put your time? Because time is a commodity that we don't get back. And so therefore, I would encourage you to be precise in your prayer. Spend more time thinking about the intention than the recitation of the prayer itself. And by being more precise, you knock on that door more sharply, and it will be opened unto you. The 11th rule that Dr. Peterson puts forward is, or sounds at least to me, quite frivolous. And again is more linked with our bringing up of the next generation. But it particularly applies to the homeschooling community at large, I think. The 11th rule is don't bother children when they're skateboarding. Sounds frivolous. You might even say that, well, my child doesn't skateboard. What's this got to do with me? But skateboarding is just an analogy. It's an analogy for that rough and tumble play that kids do. It's the analogy for them climbing trees. It's the analogy for them jumping off rocks into deep and uncharted waters. It's the analogy for them taking risks. If you don't let your child take appropriate risks, and that's based on competency and assessment, you then void their capacity to learn. If you wrap them up in cotton wool and never let them out into the big bad world, they will not understand how to use the graces that God wants to give them and the natural graces that He has already provided correctly. We learn by touching evil. It's counterproductive, I know, but it's true. As the wind blows through the branches of a tree, the tree bends and sways in order to get stronger, not weaker. Those rigid elements of our life, when confronted with real evil, tend to break rather than to move and deform. Therefore, when you're educating your children, don't disturb them when they're doing their skateboarding. Let them experience, within proper boundaries, those things that may in fact be harmful. You only learn that things are hot by touching sometimes. And when it comes to taking your place in the world, the more engaged you are in that world, the more sense of your own limitations you have, the more trust you have in God. When you think you are so full of potential that you, by yourself and your own endeavors, can do anything, life will become crushingly hard very quickly, because people will go out of their way to prove to you that you can't. The 12th rule in Jordan Peterson's book, The 12 Rules of Life, is again, on the face of it, frankly frivolous. It's stroke a cat whenever you see one in the street. Now, there's a lot to be said for this psychologically that Dr. Peterson can go into in way more detail, and again I refer you back to his lecture series and read the book itself. But from a supernatural point of view, I think the message that can be still distilled from this rule is one of thanks, one of gratitude. Take the opportunity to appreciate what's in front of you. It's not often that a cat runs in front of you, at least not a domestic cat. And when it does, take the opportunity to appreciate it for what it is. Because it's rewarding for both you and the cat. The cat purrs. It enjoys it. It wants the attention. What happens if that's a child? What happens if it's your wife or your husband? Do they not like attention too? Is it not more pleasing for them to know that you care by a tactile touch? Touching seems to connect us in a way that just words don't. It's what bonds us together. And therefore, I think what Dr. Peterson's saying is, for our own sake, we need, in order to build up that reciprocal arrangement where I touch you in order then to be touched by you, we need to be appreciative of the world around us. We need to take the time to look at and marvel at what God has given us. To look at something as simple as a cat and say, it's a cat. And in so doing, to connect with that cat in a tactile way. It's why we see so much emphasis being placed on pet therapy. It's because it works. Our own humanity is improved by our interaction with other animals. And is your husband not an animal? Are your children not little animals? So perhaps then, by appreciating them and reaching out and touching them, you can learn something about yourself and be a better person than the one you were yesterday. In that striving for perfection, the goal always has to be that grand narrative told in the book of Genesis, that after the fall of man, there is hope given for a resurrection, for a transcendence beyond this physical plane into a supernatural plane so mysterious that no one has dared even to write it down. And in so doing, we come to this mystical understanding of who we are here and now. And the chaos of the world, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that surround us, are put within a proper understanding of context. A proper understanding that Sisyphus is a better man for rolling his rock up the hill again and again, because the struggle is itself worth something when put in that supernatural component. And that's, I think, what Jordan Peterson is trying to do. I don't think he's Catholic. I don't think he's in any way about to become Catholic. But I think a lot of Catholicism can be reduced down to these natural components first, in order then to be supernaturalized and perfected. And unless we get the natural right, we know that the supernatural can easily be deformed. Grace builds on nature. So, I refer you back to Dr. Peterson's book, The 12 Rules of Life. I think it's an awesome way of explaining what should be common knowledge and common sense to all of us, but in this day and age is so lacking. Take time to study who you are. Look at where you've been. Look at where you're going. And if that's not ordered towards God, then look out. Be sure to subscribe on our YouTube channel, and thanks very much for watching. God bless.